anybody in here tell me what's the same about the Honda CRF450RL and Christopher Columbus? Huh? Huh? They both need better maps. Am I right?
Fucker. Yeah. Oh, for fuck's sake.
Luckily, it's well built though, you know? All jokes aside, those are the two main takeaways from the majority of reviews for the Honda CRF450RL and L. And for 2024, those 2 points remain true. The ECU, throttle mapping, and flameouts are all still an issue, and the throttle is still as snatchy as a Makita drill from the 80s. But for 2024, the build quality also remains there. This bike is premium, it feels incredible. I'm not going to stand on the rear fender like John T. Young to prove it. The bike is well built, we all know it. I do want to talk about, though, is the geometry. What makes this bike good on-road? It's got a 58.9 inch wheelbase and a 28-degree head angle, so it's a little bit long and a little bit relaxed. But it's great. It feels super stable on the road. It doesn't get pushed around by the wind. At just under 300 pounds, it's a really stable bike on the road. You cannot ride for long distances because it's got a super small tank. But if you got to do 100 kilometers to, let's say, Calabogie in my case, you can ride there, get gas, ride for the day, and then come home. And that's fantastic. And it's comfortable doing that kind of riding. And it's really, really enjoyable. The exhaust, though heavy, is really quiet. So on the road, it's not barking your ear off. It's just all around pretty nice to ride. Some other concessions Honda made to make it better on the road was they put a noise deadening ring on the sprocket. And all it does is it reduces the amount of slap between the chain and the groove in the sprocket as they come together. It's not a cush drive by any means, but it does actually take a lot of the noise out. The other thing that they've done is they've put vibration and noise dampening membrane injected into the swing arm. And yes, it does add a bit of weight, but it does kill the buzziness. I have a Kenda Trackmaster 2 on the rear of this bike, like I've had on the back of many other bikes. And on this one, I don't notice it as much on the road. And that's really cool. Now, that weight for sure is there, but it's really low. It lowers the bike's center of gravity. And on top of that, some of that weight is actually considered unsprung. And that, I think, actually helps the bike. I think it makes it a sneaky assassin on the hills. That unsprung weight, that super low weight, I find adds to the bike's ability to find traction, especially on steep climbs. If you're going slow and you got to pick lines, or you've got to bounce the back end around in the rough stuff, for some reason, I've run this tire on many bikes, but for some reason, this bike finds traction better. And I've got to associate that in some part to that extra weight in the swing arm. Now, like I said, the bike is longer and it's got a more relaxed head angle, so it's incredibly stable. And when you're climbing hills or you're going down hills through rough stuff, it's forgiving. It allows you to move your weight around on the bike. I'm not good at this, but the bike is forgiving. It allows me to shift my weight when I shouldn't, and it prevents me from, looping out or going over the bars quite a bit just because I've got the freedom to move around. And again, because I'm not good at this, I have to make a lot of decisions halfway up hills. I got to change my lines, change my plans. And on bikes like my Husky FE501 that don't have as much steering angle, I feel like I have to lean the bike more, which again just puts me at a higher risk of a fall, especially on the hills when I've got to do switchbacks and stuff. But on this bike, I can actually keep the bike more upright, steer harder, and for some reason it's more forgiving when I got to slow down and pick a harder line. And it's really, really nice. It just, despite being heavy and despite being big, it is a really kick-ass bike in the bush. If you can forget about the ECU, the throttling, and the cable clutch. But we'll talk about that later. Now, obviously I like the bike. 2 weeks after I got it, I went out and bought the sweatshirt. And I mean, I could list off all the other bikes that I've ridden, and we could talk about all of those in a comparison format, and we could land on why I like this. But we're going to skip over the Husky 501, we're going to skip over the T7, we're going to skip over the Desert Sled. But I will compare this to my DR650, because the DR650 also had a 58.9 inch wheelbase. It also had a 28-degree head angle. This bike feels familiar. My DR, by the time I was done with it, it had a YZ fork conversion, it had a Cogent rear shock. So I basically was riding this, but air-cooled, heavy. This bike basically solves all of those issues. Right out of the box, I've got the better suspension. I don't have to spend thousands of dollars to upgrade like I did on my DR. But I've got that same easy riding geometry that make it kind of a treat on the road and safe in the bush. The one thing that this bike does have over the DR650, and it's a huge improvement, is the distance between the 2x4 and the foot pegs. On this bike, I can ride longer in the saddle on the road because I'm not cramped. I'm not a tall guy, but I always found on the DR650 that my knees were always cramped. I always felt uncomfortable after 100 kilometers. Now, the other thing that this bike has that was the same as my DR650 is a 7/8 handlebars. And that's probably my biggest gripe with this bike. I can overlook the ECU and the throttle mapping and all of that stuff. I can't get past the 7/8 handlebars. Speaking of the throttle mapping and the ECUs, what I've done personally to mitigate some of those problems, I've copied Lex D. Fox, I'll link his YouTube channel below, and I've done a homemade throttle tamer on my throttle tube, and I've also switched to a one-finger stunt clutch. Now, I'm going to do a more in-depth video about my throttle tube. I did 5 or 6 iterations where I grooved it out, basically just to smoothen out that first 1/8 and quarter turn of the throttle, so it makes it a little bit more forgiving at low speeds. I did it by eye and a bunch of trial and error, so I'm going to do a video where I basically just measure it out and give you depths across the groove, and that way if someone really wants to, they have a pretty good chance of recreating it. Now the other thing, like I said, I did the one-finger clutch. I went on Amazon, I bought a $35 one-finger clutch, which I will also link in the description below. It's made by a company called Nice CNC. It's got 3 pull positions. Now, not only does it make the clutch a little bit easier to pull, but it also gives you a longer friction zone, which is really cool because it makes it easier to manage the bike. You can run a little bit more gas and just feather the clutch in and out more. And because it's an easier pull, you fatigue less, makes the whole thing easier. It's made a huge improvement for my ability to enjoy riding the bike longer, especially in the technical stuff. Now, I've also done an extra 100 RPM on the idle speed up to 1900. Like, I mean, everybody does that, and it actually did help quite a bit, which was cool. I've done my own skid pegs. They're not on the website yet because I'm still putting them through their paces. They're slightly different than all the other pegs that I've made so far, so I really wanted to test them out. I like a big peg. I like being able to get my feet out, away from the bike in case I need to tilt the bike over between my knees. So the big pegs are an absolute must for me. Now, the other big thing that I did on the bike, again, I'm copying another YouTuber, Pat O'Neill, who I'll also link below. He has a CRF450RL. He's an absolute shredder. His videos are phenomenal. But he has a 300L with a Kenda Trackmaster 2 on the rear and a Kenda Southwick on the front. I've copied that setup. It's awesome. It's a really good setup for a DOT-approved aggressive tire. It really works well. The only time I struggle is if it's like bare bedrock in the pouring rain, and even then it's not that bad. So tires are huge. Now I do have a few plans for the future for this bike, but I'm going to do that stuff in another video. I will say though quickly that I do want to get a Recluse. I probably will avoid getting an ECU if I can. I am going to change the exhaust. I like that it's quiet, but it is crazy heavy, so I'm going to do something there for sure, and I'm going to change out the tail. But again, I'm going to dive into that stuff more in another video because there's a lot to unpackage there. I'm going to be making a whole bunch of cool custom stuff, and I actually might document it this time around. Yeah, all in all, the big takeaway from my review of the Honda CRF450RL is that if you can get past its big glaring flaw, the 7/8 handlebars, not the ECU and the throttle map, if you can get past that, you might find that it's actually a genuinely good dual sport, and you might fall in love with it the way I did, because this is the bike I wanted to build when I had my DR650 but couldn't quite get, and now I've got it. And I'll probably keep this one until it doesn't run anymore, or until they force me to go electric, which will probably come sooner because it's a Honda. Thanks for watching. If you like my content, please feel free to subscribe, like my video, because that's what we have to do nowadays.